In 1983, one cocaine trafficker made an offer so outrageous it sounded like a scene from a movie. He offered to pay Bolivia's foreign debt, all of it, roughly $3 billion. There was only one problem. The money came from cocaine. The man making the offer was Roberto Suárez Gómez. At the height of his power, Suarez was not a street dealer. He was not a nightclub gangster. He was not a man fighting over corners in Miami. He operated much farther upstream, closer to the source, closer to the politicians, closer to the people who could decide whether cocaine moved or stopped. And according to later reporting, he had enough money, enough aircraft, enough land, and enough political influence to make an offer that most criminals would never even imagine making. Pay the country's debt. In exchange, he wanted peace, protection, a way out of the pressure closing around his family and his organization. If that sounds familiar, it should. Because if you have seen Scarface, you already know a version of this man. His name in the film was Alejandro Sosa. Calm, elegant, almost never desperate. While Tony Montana screams, threatens, and fights his way upward, Sosa seems to already own the mountain Tony is trying to climb. He controls supply. He has political connections. He moves cocaine at a scale Tony cannot match. He does not need to prove he is powerful. Everyone in the room already knows. Alejandro Sosa was fictional. Roberto Suárez Gómez was not. And the real man behind the myth may have been more dangerous than the character Hollywood created. Because Suarez did not simply sell cocaine, he helped organize supply. He built relationships with Colombian traffickers. He used aviation and ranching infrastructure to move product. He cultivated influence inside a country already struggling with political instability. And at his peak, U.S. drug intelligence reportedly estimated that his coca empire was generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year. He became known as the king of cocaine. But even that title does not fully explain his power. The real story is not just about money. It is about position. Tony Montana wanted to become rich. Sosa controlled the layer Tony depended on. And Roberto Suárez Gómez understood that same principle in real life. He did not have to own every street where cocaine was sold. He only had to control enough of the supply that everyone downstream had to deal with him. That is how a cattle rancher from Bolivia became one of the most important figures in the early cocaine trade, and how a real trafficker became the shadow behind Scarface. Alejandro Sosa never existed. Not under that name, not as the perfectly controlled Bolivian Kingpin who sits across from Tony Montana and calmly explains how much cocaine he can supply. Sosa was a fictional character created for Scarface, but he was not created from nothing. Screenwriter Oliver Stone patterned Sosa after Roberto Suárez Gómez, the Bolivian trafficker who had already become known as the king of cocaine, and Suarez himself later claimed that he had been the model for a character in the film. That does not mean every detail of Sosa came directly from Suarez. Scarface is not a biography. Sosa's mansion is cinematic. His conversations with Tony are fictional. The assassination plot involving a political dissident belongs to the movie. And the relationship between Sosa and Tony Montana does not reproduce one documented partnership from Suarez's life. But the foundation is unmistakable. A wealthy Bolivian landowner, a man from an established family, a cocaine supplier operating far above the street level, a trafficker whose power comes from controlling product rather than selling individual packages, a man surrounded by money, political access, and enough distance from everyday violence that he rarely appears desperate. That is what made Sosa different from Tony Montana. Tony is always climbing. Sosa has already arrived. Tony needs customers. Sosa has supply. Tony needs protection. Sosa appears to know the people who decide what protection means. And that difference mirrors something important about Roberto Suárez. Suárez did not become historically significant because he was louder than other traffickers. He became significant because he occupied a strategic position in the cocaine chain. Bolivia produced enormous quantities of coca. Colombian traffickers were building networks that could process cocaine and move it toward the United States. Someone had to connect those worlds at scale. Suarez became one of the men who could. His power came from land, aircraft, relationships, supply, and the ability to aggregate production from multiple sources into something much larger than one ranch or one laboratory. That is the real reason the comparison with Sosa matters. Not because Roberto Suárez lived the Scarface plot. He did not. But because Scarface understood the kind of man Tony Montana would eventually have to depend on, the supplier above the distributor, the man who could lose one customer and still have an empire. And before Roberto Suárez became that man, he was something far more respectable. A cattle rancher from one of Bolivia's prominent families. Before Roberto Suárez Gómez became the king of cocaine, he belonged to a world that looked respectable. Land, cattle, family money, and airplanes. Suárez was born in 1,932 inches, Bolivia's tropical Beni region, a vast lowland territory of ranches, rivers, wetlands, and enormous distances. He came from a prominent cattle ranching family. That matters because Beni was not a place where roads connected everything easily. Distance was a business problem. If you owned cattle across large ranches, you needed ways to move people, supplies, information, and money across difficult terrain. Aircraft solved that problem. Suárez learned to fly. He invested in airstrips. He expanded the use of small planes around his ranching operations. Researchers later noted that he helped modernize the cattle business by building landing strips on ranches and investing in what became a large, private fleet of light aircraft. At the time, none of that had to be criminal. It was infrastructure, useful infrastructure, expensive infrastructure, and, eventually, almost perfect infrastructure for cocaine. That is the key to understanding Suárez. He did not enter the drug trade with nothing. He entered with assets, land where aircraft could land, pilots who understood remote routes, planes capable of moving high-value cargo over long distances, ranches that offered privacy, relationships built through wealth and family status, and experience managing a business spread across a huge geographic area. Most traffickers have to build logistics after they find the product. Suárez already had logistics. The product came later. By the mid-1970s, cocaine demand was accelerating rapidly, especially in the United States. Suárez entered the trade during that expansion. He later claimed that he became a millionaire within months. Whether every number he later gave about his fortune was accurate is difficult to verify. But the speed of his rise is not hard to understand. He had entered a market where 1 kilogram of product could be worth vastly more after crossing borders and moving closer to wealthy consumers. And he was operating in a country sitting near the beginning of that supply chain. That gave him an advantage most famous cocaine traffickers did not possess. He was close to production, close to the people growing coca, close to the remote airstrips, close to the ranches where planes could appear and disappear. And he already understood what aviation could do for a business. That is why Roberto Suárez should not be imagined as Tony Montana before Tony Montana got rich. He was almost the opposite. Tony begins with nothing and tries to seize an empire through violence. Suárez began with property, status, transport infrastructure, and connections. The criminal opportunity attached itself to something that already existed. Cattle had taught him how to move value across difficult territory. Cocaine simply made every flight worth more. And once Suárez realized how much money could be made by connecting Bolivia's coca economy to buyers farther north, the rancher began disappearing. In his place emerged a supplier, then an organizer, then a kingpin. But to understand why that transformation happened so quickly, we have to understand something larger than Roberto Suárez. Why Bolivia became one of the most important supply rooms in the global cocaine trade. To understand Roberto Suárez, you have to stop thinking about cocaine as a drug. Think about it as a supply chain. At the beginning of that chain was coca, a plant cultivated for centuries in the Andes. Bolivia and Peru had the climate, elevation, agricultural knowledge, and rural regions where coca could be grown at scale. But coca leaves were not yet the product American users were buying. They had to be processed. Leaves became paste. Paste became cocaine base. Base could then be refined into cocaine hydrochloride powder. Every step added value. Every border added risk. Every mile toward wealthy consumers increased the price. And by the late 1970s, a powerful division of labor was emerging. Bolivia and Peru were major sources of coca and coca paste. Colombian traffickers increasingly became the specialists who converted that material into finished cocaine and moved it toward the United States. U.S. Government reports later described Colombia as the major refining center, while Bolivia and Peru remained critical sources of raw coca material. That created a bottleneck. Colombian traffickers could build laboratories. They could organize smuggling routes. They could develop distribution networks in Miami, New York, and other American cities. But those systems were useless without a reliable flow of coca-derived material from farther south. That is where men like Roberto Suárez became essential. Suarez was not trying to compete with every Colombian trafficker at every stage of the business. He did not need to. He was positioned near the beginning of the chain, and the beginning of a supply chain can control everything downstream if demand is high enough. Imagine the economics. A farmer grows coca. A local buyer aggregates the leaves or paste. A larger trafficker purchases material from multiple producers. Aircraft move that material across enormous distances. Colombian laboratories refine it. Export organizations move the finished cocaine north. Wholesale distributors break the loads apart. Street dealers sell grams. At every step, the same substance becomes more valuable. But none of those later profits exist if the upstream supply stops. That was the opportunity Suarez understood. He had land, aircraft, pilots, money, remote access, and relationships in a country sitting directly on top of a major coca-producing zone. His ranching infrastructure meant he could connect isolated production areas to buyers operating hundreds or thousands of miles away. And because cocaine demand in the United States was expanding rapidly, there was enormous pressure to make that pipeline larger. The Colombians did exactly that. A 1988 U.S. government report described how Colombian traffickers learned to refine coca paste into cocaine, and by the late 1970s, had taken the dominant role in supplying the American market. But domination of refining and export did not mean they produced everything themselves. They still depended heavily on coca and coca paste from Bolivia and Peru. That made upstream suppliers strategically valuable. And this is where Scarface accidentally teaches the right lesson. Tony Montana thinks power comes from owning more cocaine. Sosa understands that real power comes from being the man who can supply everyone else. If one buyer disappears, another buyer can take his place. If one distributor is arrested, the upstream network can continue. If one city becomes too dangerous, the product can move somewhere else. The supplier survives because the demand survives. That is why Roberto Suárez became so important. He was not merely moving contraband. He was solving a logistics problem for an exploding international market. Bolivia had coca. Colombia had refining capacity and emerging export organizations. The United States had demand. Suarez helped connect those three realities. And once he understood the value of that connection, he stopped thinking like a rancher with airplanes. He began thinking like the owner of a pipeline. Roberto Suárez did not become powerful because he discovered cocaine. He became powerful because he understood movement. That was the real business insight. Bolivia already had coca. Colombia already had traffickers willing to buy it. The United States already had customers willing to pay extraordinary prices for the finished product. What the market needed was someone who could connect those worlds repeatedly. Not once. Not with one lucky shipment. Again and again. Suarez already knew how to solve that kind of problem. His cattle business had taught him that distance was expensive. Baini was fussed. Roads were limited. Ranches could sit hundreds of miles from major commercial centers. So Suarez had invested in aircraft. He had built airstrips. He had pilots. He had land where planes could arrive without depending on crowded public airports. Time later reported that U.S. drug officials believed his fleet had originally been acquired to move beef from isolated ranches. Then cocaine changed what those planes were worth. A load of cattle products generates one kind of margin. A load connected to the cocaine trade generates another. And suddenly the same aircraft, the same airstrips, and the same knowledge of remote geography could become part of an international trafficking network. This is what separates a criminal entrepreneur from a street dealer. A street dealer asks, "How much product can I sell?" Suarez asked, "How much product can I move?" That question scales differently. If one farmer can provide coca, you have one supplier. If 50 farmers can provide coca and you can aggregate their production, you have volume. If you can move that volume to buyers in another country, you have leverage. And if those buyers depend on you to keep their laboratories operating, you no longer need to chase customers. Customers chase supply. According to later academic research, Suarez had already built landing strips across ranch properties and developed what became a major private fleet of small aircraft. Those planes had been part of legitimate cattle modernization. Now they could link remote production zones to Colombian buyers. That was the breakthrough. Suarez did not have to own every coca field. He did not have to personally refine every kilogram. He did not have to control every American distributor. He could sit in the middle, aggregate, transport, finance, coordinate, and take a profit from scale. Time reported that the DEA believed Suarez became a long-distance middleman between Bolivian coca growers and Colombian buyers. That phrase sounds modest, middlemen, but in a rapidly expanding illegal market, the middleman can become the most important person in the chain because he controls the bridge. Take away one farmer, another can replace him. Take away one Colombian buyer, another may appear. But if one organization controls enough transportation and enough aggregated supply, everyone around it becomes dependent on the network. That is how Suarez began turning geography into power. Planes moved south to north, money moved north to south. Coca and paste moved toward laboratories. Cash returned toward Bolivia. And each successful cycle made the next one easier. More money bought more aircraft. More aircraft moved more product. More product created stronger relationships with buyers. Stronger buyers created more demand from producers. It was a feedback loop. The ranching infrastructure had become trafficking infrastructure. And once that system was working, Suarez could do something more ambitious than simply move his own product. He could organize other producers around himself. That was the next transformation. Because Roberto Suárez was about to stop operating like a trafficker with planes. He was about to build something closer to a corporation. Roberto Suárez was no longer thinking about one shipment. He was thinking about an industry. That was the leap. A trafficker can make money by moving cocaine. A kingpin becomes powerful when other traffickers need his system in order to move theirs. Suarez began pulling producers into a larger structure. Instead of treating every coca grower, paste producer, pilot, and buyer as a separate transaction, he helped organize them into something more coordinated. The organization became known as La Corporación, the corporation. The name sounds almost respectable. That was part of the point, because what Suarez was building looked less like a street gang and more like an illegal holding company. Producers remained producers. Pilots remained pilots. Buyers remained buyers. But Suarez sat at the point where those pieces could be connected. He could aggregate supply from multiple sources. He could provide transport. He could provide financing. He could negotiate with Colombian buyers who needed volume. And he could use his wealth and political relationships to protect the system around him. That is why later writers reached for corporate language to describe it. One account famously compared the organization to the General Motors of cocaine, not because Suarez wore a suit and carried a briefcase, but because the scale depended on coordination. Think about how industrialization changes any business. A small producer thinks in units. A corporation thinks in flow. How much raw material comes in? How quickly can it be processed? How much transport capacity exists? How much can buyers absorb? Where are the bottlenecks? What happens if one supplier disappears? What happens if one route closes? Suarez was beginning to solve those questions for cocaine, and his position gave him leverage over both sides. Bolivian producers needed buyers. Colombian traffickers needed supply. Suarez could stand between them. That made him more than a courier, more than a wholesaler, more than a rancher who happened to own planes. He became an intermediary powerful enough to influence the economics of the entire chain. Academic research on Suarez describes Bolivia during this period as hosting what was, for a time, the largest cocaine processing network in the world. Other accounts identify him as one of the Medellín network's major suppliers. But that relationship needs to be understood correctly. Suarez did not create Pablo Escobar. He did not invent the Medellín cartel. And the Colombians were not simply employees of a Bolivian boss. The relationship was one of dependency and specialization. Suarez controlled important upstream supply. The Colombians developed enormous processing, export, and distribution capacity. Each side had something the other needed. That is why the word supplier can be misleading. It sounds subordinate. In reality, a supplier who controls enough volume can negotiate from a position of enormous strength. If Colombian laboratories needed raw material, Suarez could deliver it. If demand increased, his organization could aggregate more. If one producer failed, La Corporación could draw from others. That redundancy made the system stronger, and the money followed. By the early 1980s, U.S. intelligence estimates reported in Time placed Suarez's annual drug turnover in the hundreds of millions of dollars. That figure was an estimate, not an audited account. But even as an estimate, it shows the scale officials believed they were dealing with. Hundreds of millions of dollars do not come from a man carrying suitcases. They come from infrastructure, from repeated flights, from suppliers, from buyers, from protection, from a network capable of functioning even when Roberto Suárez himself was nowhere near the product. That is what La Corporación represented. The transformation of cocaine trafficking from opportunistic smuggling into something resembling an industrial supply business. And this is where the comparison with Alejandro Sosa becomes much more interesting. In Scarface, Sosa does not appear frantic. He does not chase deals. Deals come to him. That calm makes sense when you control supply. Roberto Suárez was building the real-world version of that advantage. He was becoming the man other traffickers had to call. And among those traffickers were Colombians who would soon become far more famous than he ever was, including Pablo Escobar. Before Pablo Escobar became the most famous cocaine trafficker on earth, he still needed supply. That is the part of the story popular culture often skips. Escobar did not create coca. He did not own every field in Bolivia or Peru. He did not personally control every upstream producer feeding Colombia's laboratories. The Medellín traffickers became extraordinarily powerful because they mastered processing, export, distribution, money movement, and violence. But the laboratories had to be fed, and Roberto Suárez was one of the men who could feed them at scale. That relationship helps explain why Suárez mattered long before his name became famous outside Bolivia. He occupied a different position in the cocaine economy. Escobar was building a network designed to move finished cocaine toward enormous consumer markets. Suárez was building a system capable of pushing raw material and cocaine base toward Colombian buyers. Those are not identical businesses, but they depend on each other. A laboratory without raw material is useless. An exporter without finished cocaine has nothing to move. And a Bolivian supplier without Colombian buyers has product but no international distribution machine. The market connected them. Research into Suárez's criminal entrepreneurship describes his aircraft network as supplying coca base to Pablo Escobar and the emerging Medellín organization. Other historical accounts identify Suárez as one of the major suppliers feeding Colombian traffickers during the period when the Medellín network was expanding. That did not make Pablo Escobar an employee of Roberto Suárez, and it did not make Suárez the secret boss of the Medellín cartel. Those are the kinds of claims mythology creates after both men become legendary. The real relationship is more interesting. It was specialization. Suárez had access to Bolivian supply, aircraft, landing strips, producers, political relationships, local knowledge. Escobar and other Colombians were developing refining capacity, smuggling routes, and distribution connections closer to the United States. Each side controlled something valuable. That created mutual dependency. And mutual dependency creates leverage. If Colombian demand increased, Suárez could expand supply. If Bolivian producers needed reliable buyers, Suárez could connect them to Colombian money. If one route became dangerous, his aviation network could shift. If one producer disappeared, La Corporación could aggregate from others. That made Suárez resilient. It also made him different from the image audiences associate with Escobar. Escobar became famous partly because his war with the Colombian state was spectacular. Bombings, assassinations, political confrontation, extradition. The violence made him visible. Suárez's power was quieter. His strength came from being positioned where the product originated. That is why comparing the two men by asking who was bigger misses the point. They were powerful in different parts of the chain. Escobar became the face of cocaine because he built an empire closer to the consumer market and eventually challenged an entire government in public. Suárez became indispensable because he helped supply the machinery behind that empire. And that is exactly why Alejandro Sosa works as a character in Scarface. Sosa does not need Tony Montana. Tony needs Sosa. Tony arrives at the mansion asking for access. Sosa already has the product, the buyers, the connections, the political relationships. He can replace Tony far more easily than Tony can replace him. That imbalance is the real historical lesson. A distributor can become famous. A supplier can become necessary. And by the early 1980s, Roberto Suárez had become necessary enough that American drug officials were estimating the value of his operations in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But money that large does more than buy airplanes. It buys land, security, influence, patronage, and eventually, the belief that normal rules no longer apply. That is when Roberto Suárez stopped looking merely like a cocaine supplier. He started looking like a man who could buy power itself. At some point, money stops buying luxury. It starts buying distance from consequences. That was the stage Roberto Suárez reached. By the early 1980s, U.S. drug intelligence reportedly estimated that his cocaine operations were generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year. One figure that circulated widely was $400 million annually. That number was an estimate, not an audited balance sheet. But it tells us how large American officials believed his organization had become. And Suarez himself seemed to enjoy the mythology. The Bolivian press once quoted him boasting that he had $400 million in 40 airplanes. Again, that was a boast. But the infrastructure around him was real enough to explain why people believed it. He owned major cattle ranches. He had access to aircraft. He could move from property to property. He had landing strips, pilots, security, and relationships with people who mattered. That kind of wealth changes how a trafficker operates. A street dealer uses money to survive. A kingpin uses money to create options. If one ranch becomes dangerous, move to another. If one airstrip is watched, use a different one. If one pilot disappears, hire another. If one local official becomes a problem, find someone with more influence. Money creates redundancy. Redundancy creates resilience. And resilience is one of the reasons large criminal organizations are so hard to destroy. But Suarez did not spend only on himself. Time described him in 1985 as cultivating the image of a Bolivian Robin Hood. That image mattered. In parts of Beni, stories circulated about Suarez helping local communities, building things, giving money, supporting projects, helping people who felt ignored by the state. The exact scale of those acts is difficult to reconstruct, and some later stories clearly became part of the legend around him. But the political logic is easy to understand. If a trafficker brings money into a poor region, he can become more than a criminal. He can become a patron. A patron creates dependency. Dependency creates loyalty. And loyalty creates silence. That does not mean everyone supported him. It means money could blur the line between fear and gratitude. A government official might see a trafficker as a criminal. A villager might see the same man as the person who paid for a road, a church, or a soccer field. A worker might see employment. A politician might see financing. A pilot might see a salary. A rancher might see a buyer. That is how illegal wealth begins creating legal influence. And this is where the comparison with Alejandro Sosa becomes much darker. In Scarface, Sosa's wealth is visible. The mansion, the guards, the estate, the calm confidence. But the real power is not the house. It is the network surrounding the house. Who answers the phone? Who owes money? Who needs protection? Who depends on the airplanes? Who benefits from the business continuing? Roberto Suárez understood that kind of power. At his peak, he did not need to own Bolivia. He only needed enough people inside Bolivia to benefit from his existence. And once cocaine money began intersecting with political instability, military ambition, and state corruption, Suárez's empire crossed another line. He was no longer just buying protection from the system. He was moving toward a world where cocaine money could help shape the system itself. Roberto Suárez had learned how to turn cocaine into money. The next step was more dangerous, turning money into politics. Bolivia entered the 1980s already unstable. Governments changed quickly. Military officers remained politically powerful. Civilian institutions were fragile. And the cocaine economy was becoming large enough that traffickers no longer had to think only about bribing one policeman or one customs officer. They could think bigger. If a criminal organization depends on aircraft, laboratories, roads, banks, and borders, one corrupt official can help. But a friendly government can transform the entire operating environment. That is the world Suarez was moving into. On the 17th of July 1980, General Luis Garcia Meza seized power in a violent military coup. The regime quickly became notorious for repression. Opponents were arrested, political figures were persecuted, critics were killed. And because major cocaine traffickers operated around the new power structure, the takeover became widely remembered as Bolivia's cocaine coup. The phrase is dramatic, but it captures something historically important. This was not simply a government that happened to have corrupt officials. Major traffickers had interests tied directly to the political order. Roberto Suárez was one of them. The Washington Post later described him as one of the principal supporters of the military regime that governed Bolivia from 1980 to 1982. It also reported that he helped finance the regime. Academic research on Suárez goes further, arguing that strong evidence links his money to the coup that brought Garcia Meza to power. That is an extraordinary escalation. A drug trafficker paying an officer for protection is corruption. A drug trafficker helping finance a political order capable of protecting an entire trafficking system is something closer to capture. And Suarez had personal connections inside that world. Luis Arce Gómez, who became Bolivia's interior minister under Garcia Meza, was related to Suarez. Arce Gómez became one of the regime's most feared figures and was later convicted in the United States on drug-related charges. That family relationship does not prove every decision of the regime served Suarez, but it shows how close the cocaine economy could sit to state power. The advantages were obvious. Police pressure could be reduced. Investigations could be redirected. Military infrastructure could protect political allies. Officials hostile to traffickers could lose influence. And people willing to cooperate with foreign drug agents could become vulnerable. This is the point where Roberto Suárez stops resembling an ordinary cartel boss. He begins to resemble Alejandro Sosa. In Scarface, Sosa's power feels almost diplomatic. He knows politicians. He discusses governments. He operates from behind walls rather than on street corners. Tony Montana can kill men. Sosa appears capable of influencing the conditions in which men are allowed to operate. That is a different kind of power. And in Bolivia, cocaine wealth was creating exactly that possibility. But this is also where the history becomes dangerous to oversimplify. Later accounts have made sweeping claims about intelligence agencies, foreign governments, covert protection, and secret alliances surrounding the 1980 coup. Former DEA agent Michael Levine, for example, later argued that U.S. intelligence interests interfered with efforts against Suarez, and that elements of the cocaine trade were protected for geopolitical reasons. Those claims became part of the mythology around the cocaine coup. Some documents and later investigations support the broader reality that Cold War intelligence activity intersected with Bolivian military politics. But that is not the same as proving that every allegation about CIA protection of Suarez is established fact. So the most defensible conclusion is narrower. Suarez's organization had become politically connected enough that major reporting linked him directly to financing and supporting the Garcia Meza regime. The cocaine economy was no longer operating outside the state. It was overlapping with it. And once that happens, the criminal business changes completely. A trafficker does not merely ask, "How do I avoid the government?" He asks, "How much of the government can I influence?" That is the question that made Roberto Suárez more dangerous than the image of a wealthy cocaine supplier suggests. Aircraft gave him mobility. Money gave him scale. But political protection could give him something even more valuable. Time. Time to move product. Time to build alliances. Time to replace seized routes. Time to grow before the state could react. And for a brief period in Bolivia, cocaine money became entangled with political power deeply enough that observers began using a phrase that sounded almost impossible. Narcostate. A criminal organization becomes dangerous when it can corrupt the state. It becomes something else when the state begins protecting the criminal organization. That was the nightmare Bolivia confronted after the 1980 coup. General Luis Garcia Meza had seized power by force. The government that followed was repressive, unstable, and deeply compromised by its connections to cocaine traffickers. This was not simply an accusation made years later by rival politicians. Contemporary United States policy treated the problem as serious enough to change relations with Bolivia. American officials refused to recognize the Garcia Meza government. Narcotics control assistance was suspended. Most other U.S. aid was suspended as well. A later U.S. government report described Garcia Meza as closely linked to cocaine traffickers. That phrase matters, because by this point, the cocaine economy was not hiding outside the institutions of the country. It had moved dangerously close to the center of power. And Roberto Suárez was one of the major figures operating in that world. The advantage for traffickers was obvious. Cocaine is not moved through one street corner. It requires space, airfields, roads, aircraft, warehouses, financial channels, people inside customs, people inside police forces, people who know when raids are coming, people who can make investigations disappear. A small bribe can solve one problem. Political protection can solve dozens at once. That is why the Garcia Meza period became so important in the history of the cocaine trade. For a brief period, Traffickers could operate in an environment where the distinction between state authority and criminal protection had become dangerously weak. Luis Arce Gómez embodied that overlap. He served as Interior Minister under Garcia Mesa. That position placed him inside the machinery responsible for internal security. Years later, he would spend almost 2 decades in a U.S. prison for drug trafficking before being deported back to Bolivia. The significance is difficult to overstate. The official responsible for internal order under a military dictatorship would later be imprisoned for narcotics trafficking. This was not merely a trafficker buying a policeman. It showed how cocaine interests could reach into the highest levels of government. For Roberto Suárez, that environment offered exactly what a large trafficking organization needs most: operational space, the ability to keep airplanes moving, the ability to keep production functioning, the ability to negotiate from strength with Colombian buyers, and the possibility that pressure from foreign drug agents could be slowed by politics before it reached him. But the idea of a narco state needs careful language. It would be easy to say Roberto Suárez controlled Bolivia. The historical evidence does not support such a simple claim. Military officers had their own political ambitions. The regime had its own ideological enemies. Bolivia was caught inside Cold War politics that extended far beyond cocaine. Different factions inside the state had different interests. Suárez was extraordinarily influential. That does not mean every general worked for him. The more accurate picture is more disturbing. Criminal wealth and state power had become mutually useful. The traffickers wanted protection. The regime needed money and allies. The relationship did not require one side to completely control the other. It only required both sides to benefit. That is how institutional corruption becomes stronger than a suitcase of cash. It becomes a system. This is also where some of the most sensational stories surrounding Suárez begin. Claims have circulated for decades about foreign intelligence agencies, covert operations, anti-communist networks, and outside powers tolerating or protecting traffickers. Some former investigators made serious allegations. Some declassified documents show that U.S. officials were monitoring coup plotting and understood how unstable and violent Bolivia had become. But those documents do not prove every later conspiracy claim. And the strongest documented fact is already extraordinary enough. The United States suspended narcotics cooperation and most aid after Garcia Mesa's takeover because the new regime was so deeply compromised. A government meant to fight cocaine had become associated with the men profiting from it. That is why calling this period a cocaine coup was not simply tabloid language. It described a frightening transformation. Cocaine money had stopped asking the state for permission. It had begun operating inside the political environment that decided what permission meant. And Roberto Suárez stood close enough to that world that his power no longer resembled the power of an ordinary drug dealer. He had become something closer to the man Scarface would later call Sosa. A supplier protected not only by guns, but by access. Scarface makes Alejandro Sosa look powerful because he never seems to need anything. Tony Montana arrives desperate. Sosa does not. Tony wants product. Sosa's product. Tony wants access. Sosa already has connections. Tony wants to become important. Sosa appears to live above the level where importance has to be proven. That difference is the key to understanding Roberto Suárez. The real power was not the mansion. It was not the guards. It was not the clothes. It was not the calm voice. It was position. Suárez sat near the beginning of the cocaine chain. That meant he was closer to the coca, closer to the producers, closer to the aircraft, closer to the routes that fed Colombian traffickers farther north. And because he could aggregate supply from multiple sources, he did not depend on one customer. That made him hard to replace. A street dealer can be replaced overnight. A distributor can be replaced by another distributor. But a supplier with access to land, aircraft, production networks, money, and political protection becomes much harder to remove. That is the kind of leverage Scarface only hints at. Sosa seems powerful because Tony needs him. Roberto Suárez became powerful because entire trafficking networks could depend on the flow he helped control. And then there was politics. The fictional Sosa speaks comfortably about governments and political problems. The real Suárez operated inside of Bolivia where cocaine wealth became entangled with military power and state corruption. Major reporting later linked him to support for the Garcia Mesa regime. That meant his influence could extend far beyond a criminal negotiation. It could affect whether police pressure existed, whether aircraft moved, whether investigations were tolerated, whether officials looked away. That is a different category of power. Tony Montana can frighten one room. A politically protected supplier can shape the environment around thousands of transactions. That is why calling Suarez simply a drug lord can actually understate what made him important. He was part trafficker, part organizer, part financier, part logistics operator, and, at his peak, a man with access to people close enough to state power that cocaine could no longer be treated as an underground business alone. Scarface gives Sosa cinematic control. Roberto Suárez had structural control. And structural control is more dangerous because it does not need to be visible. It works through dependence, through supply, through protection, through people who have something to lose if the system stops. That is also why Suarez could make an offer no fictional kingpin needed to make. Pay Bolivia's foreign debt, not because he literally owned the country, but because he had accumulated enough money to imagine negotiating with it, and eventually, that confidence created a new problem. The more visible Suarez became, the more valuable he became as a target. For the DEA, arresting one street dealer meant almost nothing. But penetrating the network of a supplier this important could expose an entire layer of the cocaine economy. And that is exactly what the United States began trying to do. Roberto Suárez had built his power by controlling distance. The DEA decided to solve that problem by getting close. Not with a raid, not with helicopters, not by chasing aircraft across Bolivia. With a sting. By the early 1980s, American drug agents already understood that arresting couriers would not be enough. Suarez was too far above them. He had layers, pilots, buyers, intermediaries, people who could move product without requiring the kingpin himself to touch it. So U.S. anti-narcotics forces tried something more ambitious. They went inside the market. Time later described the operation as one of the most elaborate stings in DEA history. About a dozen agents posed as underworld financiers and traffickers. Their job was to appear legitimate enough that people around Suarez would believe they had serious money. And serious demand. The bait was enormous. $9 million worth of coca paste. That was not a street buy. It was designed to attract people operating at wholesale scale. The agents purchased the paste. Then they arranged for two men described as Suarez associates to come to Miami for the payoff. The moment those men crossed into a jurisdiction where U.S. authorities could reach them, the operation changed. The supposed buyers disappeared. The arrests began. And the network that had depended on distance suddenly discovered that distance could be used against it. The sting mattered for more than 2 arrests. It gave prosecutors a path upward. Transactions could be traced. Relationships could be mapped. Names could be attached to supply. And Suarez himself was eventually indicted by a federal grand jury in Miami. At the time, he denied being a drug trafficker. He presented himself instead as an agro-industrial entrepreneur. That contrast was almost surreal. American drug officials were treating him as one of the most important cocaine suppliers in Bolivia. Suarez was still publicly insisting that he was a businessman, but the legal pressure was now real. The DEA had found a way to turn his biggest advantage into a vulnerability. Scale. The larger the organization becomes, the more people have to participate. More pilots, more brokers, more money handlers, more buyers, more people who can be watched, more people who can be arrested, and more people who can eventually cooperate. That is the paradox of a criminal empire. Growth creates power. Growth also creates exposure. But the most important pressure point was not an associate. It was family. In 1982, Roberto Suárez Jr. was arrested in Switzerland while carrying a false passport. He was then extradited to Miami to face cocaine trafficking charges connected to the sting. Suarez later claimed his son had effectively been kidnapped. Whatever he believed about the extradition, the effect on him was immediate. For years, law enforcement had attacked the organization. Now the pressure had reached his own family. That changed the negotiation. Roberto Suárez had spent years acting like a man who could buy routes, protection, aircraft, and influence. Now he tried to buy something far more extraordinary: his son's freedom. He wrote an open letter to President Ronald Reagan, and in that letter, he offered a deal so extreme that it became the defining story of his legend. Release Roberto Jr., and Roberto Suárez Gómez would turn himself in. But that was not all. He also wanted the United States to help erase Bolivia's foreign debt. The trafficker who had spent years operating above the law was now trying to negotiate with governments directly. And the price of that negotiation was measured not in kilograms, but in billions. For years, Roberto Suárez had protected himself with distance. Then the United States found something distance could not protect: his son. Roberto Suárez Jr. was arrested in Switzerland in 1982 while traveling under a false passport. He was extradited to Miami to face cocaine trafficking charges connected to the DEA investigation. For the elder Suárez, the case was no longer abstract. This was not another pilot, not another broker, not another associate who could be replaced. This was his son. And Suárez reacted like a man who had spent too long believing every problem had a price. He tried to negotiate. In an open letter addressed to President Ronald Reagan, Suárez proposed an extraordinary arrangement. His son would be released. Suárez himself would surrender. And the United States would help resolve Bolivia's foreign debt. The figure commonly reported at the time was roughly $3 billion. Suárez was effectively offering to put cocaine money against the balance sheet of a nation. The proposal was never a realistic diplomatic negotiation. But that may be exactly why it matters. It tells us how Suárez saw himself. Most fugitives negotiate over charges, sentence reductions, extradition, immunity. Roberto Suárez was talking about sovereign debt. He was no longer behaving like a trafficker trying to avoid prison. He was behaving like a man who believed his fortune entitled him to negotiate with governments. And according to accounts of the offer, he was prepared to surrender part of his cocaine operation as part of the bargain. The idea was staggering. The same drug economy that had weakened Bolivian institutions had created enough private wealth for one trafficker to imagine rescuing the national treasury. That contradiction became one of the defining stories of Suárez's life. A country had debt, a cocaine king had cash, and the criminal believed that difference gave him leverage. Scarface gives Alejandro Sosa a similar kind of confidence. Sosa does not speak to Tony Montana like another gangster. He speaks like someone who operates on a different level. Politicians matter to him. Governments matter. International problems matter. Tony thinks in deals. Sosa thinks in systems. Roberto Suárez's debt proposal was the real-world version of that mentality taken to an extreme. But behind the grand offer was something painfully ordinary. A father wanted his son back, and the government understood that family had become a weakness. Roberto Jr. would eventually plead guilty and receive a prison sentence in the United States. The elder Suárez remained under pressure. His public offer did not make the indictment disappear. It did not erase the DEA investigation. And it did not restore the world in which money seemed capable of solving every problem. That world was beginning to collapse, because while Suárez was focused on governments, extradition, and his son, another threat was developing much closer to home. Inside the family, inside the business, a younger relative had learned how the empire worked. He understood the aircraft, the suppliers, the Colombian connections, the money. And unlike an American prosecutor, he did not need to destroy Suárez's organization. He only needed to take it. His name was Jorge Roca Suárez. And the next man to threaten Roberto Suárez's empire would not come from the DEA. He would come from his own bloodline. Roberto Suárez had spent years worrying about governments, the DEA, extradition, political enemies, foreign pressure. But the man who did the most damage to his empire was much closer. His nephew, Jorge Roca Suárez. Inside the family, Roca knew the business. He knew the routes, the aircraft, the suppliers, the buyers, the people who could be trusted, and, most importantly, he knew where Roberto Suárez was vulnerable. By the late 1980s, the elder Suárez was under enormous pressure. His son had been arrested. The DEA had penetrated parts of the network. U.S. prosecutors had indicted him. Bolivian authorities were facing increasing international pressure to act against major traffickers. For the first time, Suárez could no longer rely on the same combination of distance, money, and political influence that had protected him for years. That weakness created an opportunity. According to reporting from the Los Angeles Times in 1988, Jorge Roca Suárez effectively took over the business from his uncle. The language used at the time was blunt. The king had been betrayed by a trusted nephew, and the empire changed hands. This is what succession looks like inside an illegal organization. There is no board meeting, no signed transfer of ownership, no legal contract protecting the founder. Control belongs to the person who can still move product, who can still pay pilots, who can still reach buyers, who can still collect money, and who can convince everyone else that the old boss is no longer the safest person to follow. That is what made Jorge Roca Suarez dangerous. He did not need to destroy the entire system Roberto had built. He could inherit the useful parts, the relationships, the knowledge, the routes, the reputation, the infrastructure, and then leave the founder behind. For Roberto Suarez, that was a different kind of defeat. The DEA could seize a shipment. A government could issue an indictment. A rival trafficker could attack a route. Those were external threats. A nephew could take the machine from the inside. And once the people operating that machine believed Jorge could protect their income better than Roberto could, loyalty became a business decision. That is the brutal logic of criminal succession. Men remain loyal while loyalty pays. When it stops paying, family becomes just another negotiation. Jorge Roca Suarez would later become a major trafficker in his own right. He was known by the nickname Teco de Paja, Roof of Straw. Authorities would accuse him of running large-scale cocaine trafficking operations linking Bolivia to international markets. Decades later, his name would still appear in major drug investigations. That tells us something about the empire Roberto Suarez had created. It did not disappear when control shifted. The network outlived the man who built it, and that is one of the greatest ironies of organized crime. Founders imagine that the organization is theirs. In reality, the organization belongs to whoever can keep it functioning. Roberto Suarez had spent years building a system where coca became cocaine became cash, and cash became influence. Then someone inside his own family learned the system well enough to take it away. By 1988, the king of cocaine was no longer negotiating from strength. He was isolated. His political protection had weakened. His organization had fractured. His nephew had taken the business, and the authorities were closing in. The man who had once imagined paying Bolivia's foreign debt was about to discover that there was one thing his fortune could no longer buy: freedom. By the late 1980s, Roberto Suarez no longer looked like Alejandro Sosa. The calm supplier above the chaos was gone. The political protection had weakened. The family business had fractured. His nephew had taken control of much of the trafficking network, and the governments that once seemed too compromised or too unstable to stop him were now under intense pressure to act. Suarez was finally arrested. The exact chronology is described slightly differently across later accounts, but the important point is clear. The king of cocaine was no longer untouchable. He was prosecuted in Bolivia and convicted on drug-related charges. The sentence was 15 years. For a man who had once been linked to hundreds of millions of dollars in annual cocaine revenue, 15 years was more than a legal number. It was the end of an era. Prison removed him from the aircraft, the ranches, the pilots, the buyers, the political relationships. The system continued without him. And that is the cruelest thing about criminal empires. They make the founder feel indispensable right up until the moment he is removed. Then the roots adapt. The buyers find someone else. The pilots work for someone else. The money moves through a different name. Roberto Suarez had built a machine, but the machine did not belong to him anymore. He was released early in 1996 after serving roughly 8 years. By then, the world that had made him powerful had changed. Pablo Escobar was dead. The Medellín cartel had collapsed. The cocaine trade had fragmented into new organizations and new routes. Bolivia was still part of the Andean drug economy, but the age in which one rancher trafficker could become a national political force had passed. And Suarez himself had changed too. The fortune was largely gone. The mythology remained. The airplanes. The ranches. The stories about political power. The claim that he could pay Bolivia's foreign debt. The reputation as the real-world shadow behind Alejandro Sosa. But the man behind those stories was older, less powerful, and increasingly reflective about what the empire had cost. Late in life, Suarez publicly said that entering the cocaine trade had been the greatest mistake he ever made. That statement is easy to dismiss as regret after defeat, but it also reveals something the Scarface myth rarely shows. The Kingpin survives long enough to see the empire disappear. Tony Montana dies at the peak of his mythology. Sosa simply fades out of the movie. Roberto Suarez had to live through the aftermath. He watched the business move on without him. He watched the fortune disappear. He watched the legend become more famous than the man. And when he died in 2000, the king of cocaine no longer had a kingdom. But Hollywood had already given him something harder to erase. A fictional double. Alejandro Sosa. Scarface gets many things about Alejandro Sosa wrong, but it gets one thing almost perfectly right. Power does not always belong to the man holding the gun. Sometimes it belongs to the man everyone else has to call. That is what separates Sosa from Tony Montana. Tony lives inside the chaos. He fights for territory. He kills rivals. He screams at partners. He burns through loyalty. His power is visible because it has to be. Sosa operates differently. He sits above the conflict. He controls access to product. He deals with politicians. He speaks to Tony as if Tony is useful, but replaceable. That is the real insight. Because Roberto Suárez became powerful in much the same structural way. Not because he personally controlled every shipment, not because he owned every laboratory, not because every trafficker in South America answered to him, but because he occupied a position others needed. He could aggregate supply. He had aircraft. He had remote infrastructure. He had relationships with Bolivian producers. He had access to Colombian buyers. And he operated in a political environment where cocaine money could buy influence far beyond the street. That is exactly why Sosa feels so different from Tony. Tony is rich. Sosa is connected. Tony has soldiers. Sosa has systems. Tony controls a mansion. Sosa seems to control consequences. And Roberto Suárez's real power looked more like that than the violent fantasy audiences usually associate with cocaine kingpins. The most dangerous part of his empire was not what people could see. It was what they depended on. Supply, transportation, political protection, money, relationships. That kind of power creates distance. A distributor gets arrested. The supplier finds another distributor. A route closes. The network finds another route. A politician falls. The organization looks for another protector. That is why upstream figures can survive longer than the men who become famous farther down the chain. Scarface turns that idea into one character, Alejandro Sosa. Reality was messier. Roberto Suárez was not Sosa, but Sosa was built from the kind of power Suárez represented, and that is why the comparison still works. Tony Montana became one of cinema's most famous gangsters because he rises violently and dies spectacularly. Sosa is more frightening because he does not need the spotlight, and Roberto Suárez became historically important for the same reason. He was not the loudest man in the cocaine trade. He was one of the men the cocaine trade depended on. So was Roberto Suárez Gómez really the man behind Alejandro Sosa? Not literally. Sosa was fiction. Suárez was real, and the two were never the same person. But the comparison survives for a reason, because Scarface understood something fundamental about the cocaine trade. Tony Montana is the man audiences remember. He is loud, violent, ambitious, visible. He rises fast, and he dies in a way no one can forget. Sosa is different. He does not need to be the most visible man in the room. He only needs to control what everyone else needs. That is the part Roberto Suárez understood in real life. He did not have to own every laboratory. He did not have to control every American city. He did not need to personally move every kilogram. He had to control enough supply, enough aircraft, enough relationships, and enough political access that people farther down the chain depended on him. That is structural power. And structural power is harder to see than a gun. It is also harder to replace. A street dealer disappears. Another takes his place. A distributor is arrested. Another distributor moves in. But when a supplier controls the flow itself, everyone below him feels the disruption. That was Roberto Suárez's real advantage. He sat close to the source. He helped aggregate production. He helped move coca-derived material toward Colombian traffickers. He turned ranching infrastructure into trafficking infrastructure. And at his peak, he became wealthy and politically connected enough to imagine negotiating with governments. That is what makes his story more disturbing than the Scarface myth. Tony Montana represents criminal ambition. Alejandro Sosa represents criminal position. And Roberto Suárez represented what happens when position becomes influence. He eventually lost the empire. He went to prison. His family network fractured. His fortune faded. He died in 2000, but the structure he represented did not disappear. The cocaine trade simply moved on to new suppliers, new routes, new organizations, and new names. That may be the final lesson behind Scarface. The most famous gangster is not always the most powerful man in the chain. Sometimes the most dangerous man is the one behind him, the one supplying him, financing him, protecting the system around him, and making sure that if he falls, the business keeps moving.